Hey guys, this is Guilherme here once again, and today we're to bring you a miniature played at FlyOrDie website once again, but this game was pretty brilliant. Once again, I didn't watch the game completely. I missed a great part of it. I do say I seen only the end game of it, but it was simply brutally played. It was very well played. Here the nicks are white as B Junior and black as Xiconeves together. White started with E4, black with the Sicilian defense C5, F4, C6, knight C6, knight to F3, pawn to D6, bishop to E2, preparing to castle, knight to F6, attacking pawn, pawn to D3, protecting, pawn to E6. This is almost a dragon variation, with the exception that besides the knight not being attacked by the dark square's bishop, the bishop of f8 is not on fianchetto as well. Here white castled and black prepared to castle as well with bishop to e7. Pawn to a3, pawn to a6, knight to c3, pawn to b5, very aggressive, getting aggressive into the queen side. Bishop to e3, quite the odd move, I'd say. You develop your bishop, but you get no action at all into this square. Pawn to d5, attacking the pawn. And here white decided to close the center instead of capturing, and also attacking the knight together with it. But then knight to g4, and now bishop to f2, which makes no difference at all because the knight is still attacking, so quite incomprehensible. Then knight takes bishop and rook takes knight. Then now black finally castled, queen to d2, queen to c7. Pretty good response here, because the white's queen is getting to this diagonal and you start to counter attack into this diagonal as well. So a diagonal near the enemy's queen. Now pawn to d4, trying to break the black's structure a little. Here black decide to take with the knight, then an exchange of knights happen, and now the knight is being attacked, so of course queen takes pawn. And now a very good play by black, which was bishop to c5, supported by the queen, and now the rook's falling. Queen to d3, and queen to b6, doubling the pressure into that pinned rook. Rook to f1, it's kind of a obligatory move, and bishop to b7. And you can see that black is enjoying a pinned rook that basically can have no defense, since the dark square's bishop isn't in the game anymore. So black is enjoying the pinned rook to keep developing pieces. Pawn to a4, trying to break that pawn structure a little, but black doesn't have to care to that at all. But even so, it advances the pawn to b4, getting aggressive. If the pawn remained here, it wouldn't be that bad as well. It would still be defendable. But anyways, black decided to aggressive it with pawn to b4, Now pawn to a5, very aggressive as well. Attacking the rook, the queen, and also trying to break this position here, which is very strong. The queen and the bishop aiming to a pin the rook that can't be defended at all properly is a pretty aggressive, is a pretty good move. Now black decide to take the rook with bishop takes f2 check, and now rook has to take back, and now queen took the pawn. And that knight is still threatened. And now knight to d1. Queen to c5, pinning the rook once again. Queen to h3. Probably planning to play bishop to d3. And threatening the checkmate here. And here black actually blunders. White blunders because queen takes pawn. And now bishop to d3, protected by the queen, threatening the checkmate, and the rook is attacking the queen. So you have to defend your queen and also protect the checkmate. And here the only way that black could actually defend this checkmate and the queen was taking the knight with check. Now rook to f1, the mate threat still happening, and now queen takes rook and with check, and king takes queen. Even though the queen was sacrificed to avoid the checkmate, you can see that white is pretty much hanging, because okay, it's an even end yet. The checkmate threat, so it has to be protected. And besides the checkmate threat, there is also this queen versus bishop and two rooks versus bishop ending. So it's pretty even. The end game is pretty even because the same color, the same square of bishops, same color squares, square colors I mean, and the two rooks against the queen, so it's pretty even. And now pawn to g6, protecting the mate of course. Pawn to g4, pawn to a5, getting out of the attack from the bishop, and just advancing this pawn, getting out of the attack of the bishop, making the pieces more active because this bishop and this rook were on protection duty into this pawn, so he advanced the pawn to release all the protection pressure. Now pawn to f5, trying to break the structure, and now pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. You can take this pawn again, but it would quite break the structure of black, so this would be no good. And here instead black played bishop to a6, which is a fair move. You give up a bishop to stay against a queen having only the two rooks, but at least you eliminate the mate threat, and also you make your opponent be with a queen only. Do you remember that old saying? A queen is a strong piece, but a queen alone can't do anything. Almost anything. Depends a lot on the position and stuff, of course. But if the things are equal as it is in this position, and now you'll be with a queen against two rooks, the queen will hardly enter effectively into the territory. So it was a pretty good move by black. And of course this bishop has to be taken because it will fall anyway. If black did that, this is because it wishes to exchange the bishops. The bishop is pinned, so just take the bishop already. Bishop takes bishop and rook takes bishop. And now pawn to f6. And pawn to f6, I just say it is a mistake. Because, okay, you make a strong center here, but there are two things wrong with that. One, the open column, the open E column, so the rooks can act into this lonely pawn, and the queen has to become a bit enslaved this pawn. And second, you didn't open the enemy's king side one bit, so the enemy's king is still pretty safe. It's okay that if pawn takes pawn, then pawn takes pawn with discover check, but so what? Just move the king and you're safe, and you don't have to worry with a delayed pawn. But white committed this mistake. And now pawn to h5, just making a very strong structure around the king. And these two pawns are passed, so there's no single way of attacking this pawn. So this pawn is basically God here because it's totally unattackable in this position, into these pieces situationing, simply unattackable. So a very strong pawn here. Now queen to e3. Queen to e3 has the clearly purpose of going to h6, gaining this diagonal here and the mate threat into g7. Of course black covers this up with king to h7, and now queen to d3. Now attacking the rook, and now black doubles the rooks to protect. Queen takes the pawn. King to g8. Queen to d2. King to h7, protecting once again the entrance of the queen here. Queen to d7, pinning this pawn and threatening of taking it. And now rook from c to b to from a6 to a7. Sorry, I really confused the stuff here. Now queen to a4, and queen to a4 is such a passive move that I don't know what white was thinking to make such a passive move. Perhaps busting the defense of this pawn, as these two rooks are lined. Yeah, this was pretty much the intention, but even so it's very passive, so I don't like this move at all. Now rook to d8 and pawn to b3. Pawn to b3 is another mistake, but because now the queen can't act into this diagonal anymore. King to g8. Now there are no more threats around here, and the queen can't go to threat it again right now. So just buying time that it has now. A good move here could have been pawn to e6, because you will sacrifice a pawn, but you open the enemy's king side a little, even though sacrifice a pawn. And also this pawn is only a headache around here. It is an easy target, even though it's an end of 2 rooks against a queen. It's an easy target here because only the queen can protect it. So you could do this e6 sacrifice just to open the king side a little, because in this position white can't do much because the king is totally safe. So white can't do much here. Now king to e2, trying to get to the center and also busting any checks of the rook. King to f8, king to e3, rook to d5, attacking this pawn and also double protecting this a5 pawn, so you can freely take this pawn if you want to. And now king to e4, attacking the rook, and rook to d7, from a7 to d7, and this pawn is still protected by this rook, so everything's fine. Here definitely you could once again push this pawn, but black didn't want it. And did you see that mistake of not taking the pawn here before and instead advancing this pawn? Because now this pawn is vulnerable and you have to protect it. So white is basically being a slave of this pawn right now. Queen to c6, and queen to c6 is quite the move. You can't attack this with the rook back because of this vulnerable pawn. Even though it's a vulnerable pawn, it's playing a good role now, because you can't come to d6 attacking the queen. Why is queen to c6 quite the move? For this position it's quite the move because after rook to d4 check, king to f3, rook to d3 check, king to e2, you're setting a trap here, because if rook takes this pawn, queen goes to c8, and because of the position of the king he can't go to the 7th column, to the 7th line, and then the rook would have to return, and this would be made after queen takes rook. So these rooks have to be aligned now, or else it could be mate on a8, b8, c8, whatever. The rooks have to be aligned now while this pawn structure still remain. Now rook goes, but of course black saw that and played rook back to d5 to protect this pawn. I think this was the best move as well, and as I said, I just saw the end game of this game. So I saw this part of course as well, and I said, well, rook back to d5 looks the best move here, and it is. Now here white committed a mistake. The mistake was already advancing his pawn and leaving this pawn here unprotected, because as I said, this pawn is unprotected, only the queen can defend it. The mate can't happen because the two rooks are aligned, so you just waste your time going to a8 with check. And besides wasting your time, after rook to d8, the queen has to retreat somewhere to escape from the rook's attack. And after queen to b7, this allows black to finally counterattack with rook takes pawn on e5 with check, king to f3, rook to f5, check once again, and now black simply black played this position simply monsterly, and now the queen takes this other pawn here and the mate threat is over. And what did I say? A queen alone can do anything. The queen was doing something because of the strong pawn structure that were near the king, but now that these pawns are gone, the queen can do anything to attack the king effectively. And now queen to e7, attacking the lonely pawn, and once again, and now queen rook to f5, protecting. What I just say, the queen can't do anything. This pawn on h2 is useless because this pawn can't break any of these pawns structure. The pawn on b3 is hopeless while this a5 pawn doesn't fall. So white is pretty much running to a dead end here, and once again, as I just said, right now black started to play with computer proficiency here. Queen to b6, attacking the lone rook. Rook to e8 check. King to d3. King to g7, getting into a safe square. As I said a while before, this king side is totally safe for the king, mainly now because this rook on f5 protects this pawn, so the king can roam free around here with no worries of losing a pawn and getting attacked. King to c4, and now rook to c8 check. King to d3, rook to c3 check. And this is quite worth. The only pawn that could have any kind of future if black made some mistake is now falling. As I said before, this pawn on h2 is hopeless. It can't do anything. So now white is just slowly running to cold death. And of course this move to it would still be viable, but not so good without a check, because now the pawn falls instantly. So now rook to c3 check, the king has to go somewhere safe, and now rook takes the pawn on b3. This position, even though white has a queen against the rooks, after this white could quit with no regrets. It could simply quit after this, but try to put some fight yet with queen to d4 and king to h7. As I said, the king is totally safe here. The rook protects the pawn on the last line. The king can roam around here safely with no big threat of the queen coming. While he roams around here, those pawns didn't try to break a little of this protection. As I said before, it was a mistake. And now, as I said just before, you just wait for your death. Your death. You can't do anything but wait slowly to lose. And now queen to a7, which is another mistake because now rook can enter to b2 with check. As I said before, this pawn is protected by the rook. Why to even try to attack this pawn if this pawn still has a rook protecting it, and you only have the queen? It's useless. Now king to e3, agonizing, because now rook takes another pawn. No pawns left for white. 2 rooks and 5 pawns against a mere queen. A queen is a strong piece, of course, but alone it's a mere queen. King to e4, stupid attempt to get some counterplay, and now it allows rook to h4 check, king to d3, rook to h3 check, king to e4, and pawn to b3. And now the white's queen will basically act as a rook of an endgame rook, trying to protect the pawn's advance. And noticing how the queen would have to act, enslaved it to protect the pawn's advance. White simply quit the game and said, okay, I'm fine, I can do anything else here, so I'll just quit. And that was it. That's why I said it was a brilliant game. Because of a blunder that I had not seen before, because I didn't see the full game, as I said, but because of a blunder, Black had to sacrifice his queen, but even so put up an amazing end game against White, with these two rooks working completely fine against the queen. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I see you next time. And seriously, from the matches that I tried to search for now, this was a very amazing one, and I'm glad I saw this, even though it was only the end game action. I'm glad I saw this. I could upload some games like Najarth or Tall or some of these guys that were really good at chess, but I don't feel like uploading so much repetition, you know. These games are the main in YouTube already, with so many YouTubers that have already uploaded this kind of games. So I don't feel like uploading games that already exist throughout all the YouTube chess world. So I try to get something new, you know, like the Kasparov game of this year, for example. I hope you guys are enjoying the content I'm bringing so far, and I see you in the next